Hello and welcome to this live event from Marketplace Risk. We still have attendees arriving, so we will start in a couple of minutes. Hello and welcome to the new spring series of live events from Marketplace Risk. I'm Elle Tucker. I'm chair of the advisory board here at Marketplace Risk, and I'm also host of our platform podcast. I am delighted to welcome today Zac Cohen, who is CEO of Trulioo, and Cameron D'Ambrosi, who is principal of One World Identity. Our live events explore complex risk management, trust and safety, and legal subject matter to help marketplace and sharing economy startups navigate the most pressing issues. Check out marketplacerisk.com to access over 100 hours of recorded content through our master's program, the platform podcast, and our previous webinar series, and to check out our upcoming events for 2021 and other ways to connect with the marketplace startup ecosystem, including our Slack forum and our other channels. Thanks for tuning in to today's session, which is called Top 10 Fraud Signals Marketplaces Should Monitor with Zac and Cameron. Before we start, I have a couple of housekeeping items to run through. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available for you to access on our website. Secondly, all attendees have listening only capabilities and are otherwise muted. Thirdly, do please submit any questions you have via the control panel. If we have time at the end, we'll answer as many as we can. But if we don't get to your question, please feel free to email it to us at info@marketplacerisk.com and we will get your questions answered. Zac and Cameron, over to you.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction, and hello everyone. Hey Cam, how are you today?
Doing well. Dug myself out from underneath the snow, so feeling good, energized, and ready for an exciting conversation.
Awesome, I love it. Yeah, I saw the snowstorms on the East Coast there, a little scary, but good stuff all the same. So as we saw today, we're going to take a look at the fraud market today, which is a growing and impactful situation for a lot of organizations in the digital world today. Let's just start a quick introduction. So again, my name is Zac Cohen. I'm the COO over at Trulioo. We're an identity verification provider on a global scale. I've been in what you'd call regulatory technology for a little over 10 years now. So it's been a really fascinating industry and definitely quick growing with the merge to digital. What about you, Cam? Quick intro.
Sure. Principal over at One World Identity. We are a market strategy and research firm, kind of laser focused on digital identity across industries. Been with the company pretty much since its inception around 4.5 years ago. And we really founded OWI on the belief that digital identity was the next big thing, if you will, and really take the view that digital identity is a horizontal that really underpins nearly every market segment across the broader economy, and work towards kind of breaking down some of those silos that have persisted, and getting organizations to think about digital identity holistically, and maybe outside of just their segment of the market, because we think that's going to be tremendously beneficial for enterprises, individuals, and governments alike.
I love it. And you've been in the business for a long time, and so much value in terms of what you and your organization bring to the landscape and insights. So just really excited to have you here today. So thanks again for taking the time to join.
It's my pleasure. Always love to talk digital identity. My podcast is mentioned down here below. That's a weekly digital identity focused podcast. So always glad to talk some shop.
Awesome, great. So what are we going to do today? So, a quick overview for the folks that have attended. We're going to talk a little bit about the fraud landscape. We're going to specify around marketplaces and their relation to it. We want to talk about data protection. We want to talk about strategies to mitigate fraud. And then at the end, we really want to touch on, like you said, Cameron, that identity verification piece and how that can help and how that fits into our fraud and risk landscape today. And let's talk about that landscape today. So, we're seeing on our side, since, the reality of the environment in the world today, a massive surge on top of an already aggressive climb to digital. Businesses are moving their entire workflows, all of their services online, as we are forced to reduce our physical interactions. And with the larger increase in traffic, with the larger increase in organizations coming online, unfortunately, we've seen an equally aggressive attack vector that is taking advantage of new populations that maybe don't have the same level of experience or are entering new areas and markets on the digital economic landscape and slide. And that really comes down to fraud. And so we're seeing just an unfortunate increase in the area, in the individuals being targeted, and the sophistication of the attacks on organizations transacting and operating online. Cameron, would you agree? And what other insights have you seen in terms of a changing fraud landscape?
Yeah, I mean, look, fraud is one of the world's oldest professions, certainly. And, I think what we're seeing is the logical conclusion of more and more interactions moving into the digital space is fraudsters are going to be consistently probing and looking for weaknesses. I think the thing to consider is not think about fraud as something that happens, on an individual level. Like there's the stereotypical, guy in a dark hoodie at a glowing green screen of code in a basement somewhere targeting like, hey, I'm going to defraud Zac Cohen, although, certainly could happen. This is an industry. It's an industry just like any other. And these folks are opportunistic, they're funded, and they have a P&L just like every organization like OWI, like Trulioo does. And these folks are going to maximize their return on investment by identifying the areas that they think they can make the most money, and they're going to continually and systemically strike until those weaknesses are addressed, and then they're going to move on and look for other opportunities. So realizing who your opponent is and what that approach is going to be, and that, if you get targeted by a fraud ring, the bleeding may not stop until you put an end to it, because, just like any other business opportunity, someone has recognized an opportunity for profit, and they're going to keep exploiting it until that opportunity dries up.
It's so important to lay it out like that, because some individuals or organizations think, oh, it was a one-off, when you're absolutely right. These are professionals who do this for a living, unfortunately, and have global reach, high sophistication, and a proven approach that continues to work. And it's a tough one, because just as it's almost an arms race, as you put in more layers of defense, there are more aggressive individuals working to tear those down and find the entry points and gaps in that defense perimeter. So you're absolutely right. This is a business model, and individuals need to have equally sophisticated approaches and take it very seriously to combat the rising threats. Right?
Yep. And, I think it presents an opportunity as well in the sense that, look, these to some degree are what you could be considered to be rational economic actors, which means, all you have to do is you have to make the opportunity cost of breaking down your defenses more than the potential, profit net out the back end. So, the fact that these are well-funded and well-financed and organized gangs that are doing this is scary in some regard, but it also means, if you protect yourself correctly, they're quickly going to realize, like, hey, it's costing me $1.10 for every dollar of fraud that I can commit, and I'm going to go find another target because, it's not an overstatement to say that, like, they have management organizations and structures, and like there's some guy sitting in a cubicle worrying about hitting his fraud KPIs, like, oh man, my fraud boss is gonna can me if I don't hit my numbers, which is hilarious to think about, but it really is that structured in many regards.
And that's definitely the point, is to get to a point where you can implement these tools effectively. And the good news is there is help out there, and there are a lot of ways to get to that point where you're making it more trouble than it's worth, or at least taking, legitimate and good steps forward that can dramatically reduce the fraud attempts and the fraud success on your ecosystem. So why don't we take a look? And I think that you and I both have had a lot of experience with in organizations, but also customers and just colleagues in the industry around what are the big fraud signals, what is the most likely attempt looking like today. And I think we have a couple examples here where we talk about misappropriated information, people leveraging information that is not theirs, and so they're appearing like a good customer or a user. We have areas where we see somebody signing up for a service, but when you ping their location and compare that to the address or the identity information they're submitting, there's mismatches there. We have a variety of different fraud signals, and we're going to share some more on the next slide. But Cameron, I wanted to get your viewpoint. Are you seeing instances with organizations where they're encountering all of these? Do we typically see one or another? Is one rising more than the other? What's your feeling and your experience today with organizations trying to combat some of these signals and how to detect them?
Yeah, so I think our perspective and what we're seeing both in terms of how fraudsters are attacking and how organizations are defending is, any one signal can be great to leverage, but these are, you think of them as almost pixels that independently, you zoom all the way into a photo, you see one red pixel, one blue pixel, one green pixel. Well, what am I looking at? But you pull out and you look at all these dots together, and that picture emerges. So what we are really seeing is the criticality of taking a holistic and kind of omni-channel approach to your interactions with your customer, and looking at all of those signals, whether it's device level signals, whether it's identity level signals, whether it is transaction level signals, and weaving those together into a tapestry, a picture, if you will, that really can let you appropriately score the risk of that customer, and then put the appropriate amount of friction in front of them. Some of these certainly, like, look, stolen consumer data and PII in combination with a couple pieces like mismatched geolocation or phony email address, that might pop immediately. There's some great networked intelligence platforms that are out there that, for example, highlight high risk email addresses. So in some ways that might be a single signal that can give you a hint that you might be dealing with a fraudster. But in general, what we recommend is to take an approach of looking at all of these signals. Someone might be giving an email address or have a region that's a higher risk region, but then you drill down further and you can see that, okay, they've interacted with my platform a number of times at this billing address and at this shipping address, and we haven't seen them charge back these transactions at all. It hasn't been reported as fraud. They might be using a VPN, but we've seen them consistently using the same VPN provider over time. So they might just be someone who's privacy conscious. We have taken the effort to go to their mobile network operator and verify maybe a linkage to the billing name against their account name. And we've also maybe sent them an SMS OTP to confirm that they are in control of that device at this point in time. And maybe we also looked and made sure that they haven't been SIM swapped recently. There's providers you can pick that data up through. So any one of those points of data might not be enough, but you bring those all together and you start to think, okay, I'm feeling pretty good that maybe this person actually is a customer that I might want to let through based on a meshing together of all those different signals.
It's such an important theme when we're talking about fraud, because if you are a risk officer, if your role in an organization is to detect fraud, protect against fraud, build tools that can reduce your risk of fraud, you'll often see maybe one signal that you think, okay, well, maybe it was a one-off, maybe it's not a big deal, or you think that that's your only issue. When the reality often is we see all of these different examples of user behavior or different information being submitted that doesn't look completely accurate or legitimate, and it often is tied together into a whole. And it becomes a bit of, at least in our experience, what we've seen with customers, a little bit of a whack-a-mole type scenario where you think you're solving the biggest threat, but it turns out that it just goes then to the path of least resistance, and it comes up in a different area. You really do, I agree completely, need to be thinking about all these different scenarios as a holistic body of work so that you can tie together the different workflows that will protect against it. And here are some additional examples. Two-factor validation or verification, authentication, a great element, but somebody could spoof that information, and you really do need to take a look at their user behavior when they're in your ecosystem. And I think that these additional fraud signals that we're seeing here around user behavior or ongoing information, it even further stresses the holistic model. It's not just always on the account creation process. It's really over the life cycle of that individual as they interact with your service. So what kind of activity and actions are they taking? And what kind of alerts can you put in place that can map the original information, the original signals with an ongoing body of work to really get the best view of an interaction and really a customer relationship, so that it's successful in your routing out fraudsters and keeping your ecosystem healthy and clean, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, what we know, obviously as a consultant, 80-20 rule comes into play a decent amount. And what we've seen working with, for example, I've done some work with marketplaces that are doing things like selling, rare sneakers, for example. And they will tell you they have a number of super user customers that account for a tremendous amount of the overall sales volume on their platform. And if you were to just willy-nilly apply, transaction amount or velocity limits broadly across your entire customer base, you're going to be throwing big elements of friction at maybe some of your most profitable customers and risk losing that relationship. So, do you want someone who has never transacted with your platform to be able to load up 20 high value items in under 30 seconds and hit checkout to a shipping address you've never seen on your platform? Probably not. If you have a pattern of behavior over time that this person is, a whale, so to speak, they are going to do a very high amount of high dollar transactions in a short amount of time. But I've seen their device before. I've seen their IP address before. They've verified their identity, again, through either enhanced IDV with photo documentation, or we've gotten a good bead on their mobile identity. You want to make sure that you can allow those people to move through as you begin to build that trust. Conversely, if all of a sudden you get a pop on that pattern of, hey, this guy has high transaction value, but all of a sudden he's shipping to a new place and it's a new IP address and we've never seen this device, you want to throw that alert up. And having that process in place to handle those as well and make sure the right area of your organization is handling the interaction with the customer, I think is also critical, because
it's really
customers appreciate.
Yeah, it's really a perpetuality of that flow. And that's why I think, and we always stress a lot of that communication and collaboration internally in your organization, because a lot of people joining today will say, yes, I understand these and we're trying to implement tools, but it really comes down also to the organization itself and how you communicate and coordinate internally between the different stakeholders in your business and in your organization so that we can share that information and make sure it's an effective barrier against these types of risks and threats. I think we're going to do a poll right now. So we're going to launch a poll and just try and get a good idea of where folks are actually seeing fraud and what kind of fraud they are actually encountering. So I think, is that going to launch up right now? Yeah. All right. Can folks see that out there?
I can see it, although I've been informed that panelists do not have a right to vote, sadly.
Okay. All right. Okay.
And, you know, I was
Yep.
going to say, Zach, just to piggyback on that last point, you know, that approach to taking a holistic view of digital identity applies, you know, across industries, but also internally within organizations as well. And one of the most critical elements to success that we see is enabling your fraud team to communicate effectively with the other parts of your business, make sure they have access to the information that they need, as well as can be, you know, sharing the signals that they're seeing across two different stakeholders to make sure, again, that you know, all of those different data points that you're gathering about a customer and their relationship with your organization can be leveraged by your fraud and risk team, which is going to, one, ensure that the fraudsters get caught, but two, make sure that you are not you know, burdening your good customers, which is quite frankly just as much of a concern as, you know, catching fraud. You know, you can get down to zero fraud, but guess what? You'd have no customers left because everyone would leave your platform because the burden of transacting would be so high. So it is that balance, and communication is key to really finding that appropriate middle ground between friction and, you know, platform integrity.
Excellent. And it looks like a fake profile was the top response from participants today, which makes a lot of sense. And that's actually a really nice segue for what we're going to talk about a little bit later, to how to attack and deal with those fake profiles. So this is really great stuff. So let's shift gears a little bit. So we talked about the landscape, some great insights there around what we're seeing today, what the risks are, how we're going to attack them. Let's talk about sort of a more robust program and how to deal with all of this. And I think the first thing that we always talk to customers about, and it's a well-known industry matter and approach, is all about risk, right? And how we can move to a risk-based approach. So for those that aren't completely familiar with the terminology, it's really important to understand what this means and how it works. And what a regulator typically takes into account is the wide diversity of the organizations who are trying to deal with these types of risk and fraud, but also their compliance or regulatory obligations. And so how do we come up with a program and a system that can deal with these differing scenarios, but still get to the right output and result that you're looking for? And we, again, often talk about a risk-based approach, which means that I can collectively identify and understand my ecosystem, my customers, my environment, and put together a real set of rules, norms, workflows, and processes that will hopefully help to mitigate against all of the various different risks. And it also allows you to be really flexible in that approach so that you can adapt to different scenarios over time in the future, or different business units even within your own organization. And so it really is a systematic methodology to determine what the best approach is, depending on the unique characteristics of a given situation, user, customer, transaction cycle, jurisdiction even around the world, and how you're dealing with all of those different matters. Cam, what have you seen in terms of like how people talk about risk-based approaches and what it means to their organization?
Yeah, you know, and I think I teased a little bit of that out with talking about balancing those, you know, competing demands in some regard of fraud tolerance and risk tolerance, and the friction you want to put in front of your user. And I think for, you know, for financial services organizations, that risk-based approach is a bit more prescriptive when it comes to the regulatory guidance. But what we see with other types of platforms is, again, thinking about, okay, when my customer comes in, what can I do to ensure that I'm going to give them as great of a user experience as possible and allow them to transact as much as we can without layering too much additional friction on top of them. And then as they, let's say, increase their spending, as they might order some higher value items, as they reach certain payout thresholds, for example, if it's a platform like a marketplace transaction platform, as they start hitting higher dollar thresholds and as the risk of the potential fraud grows, then let's gradually introduce additional identity verification steps, gather more information, and both meet my risk needs as well as layering in those asks of the customer, so it's not just in snow terms an avalanche, right? Any one snowflake isn't the one that caused the avalanche to start. And the difference between a delightful user experience and dropping out of the funnel can be a matter of just the velocity, if you will, of when you're requesting that information. Let someone transact and feel like they have some skin in the game and that they're vested in your platform, and then say, oh, we suggest that you might want to scan your identity documentation, which will enable us to unlock these additional value add services for you as part of our offering, and make them feel like they have really a partner with you, instead of an antagonistic threat of like, hey, we're going to boot you unless you do this.
Absolutely. And I think what conversation we often have with our customers today, and I'm sure you've seen it as well, is it's all about balance. And an approach we took 5 years ago might be different than today, and it will be different from 5 years from now. But it's really okay to measure that balance in terms of healthy friction in that process and understanding your risks, and making sure that you're taking the right steps to get to the outcome that you really want. I think that we talked already about a few of the key benefits for this, like a risk-based approach. Balance is really one of them, allowing you to shift and move with depending on the circumstance. Really, point forward on customizing that experience. And you mentioned a really important one, which is meeting the regulatory requirement, which today we're talking a lot more about fraud and risk, but oftentimes, right, compliance and that reg obligation, it goes hand in hand in many ways, and one can leverage the other. And you're right about a more prescriptive approach when we talk about KYC or AML as part of that sort of risk-based theme. What are the mandatory checks that we need to make? And how I think is really interesting, which we've seen a lot of customer conversations around, is we know we have to do X, Y, and Z to satisfy the regulatory approach. And that's built in our risk-based model. But how can we leverage all of that information to then combat fraud, to then fight even risk on a few different vectors? So then again, we are talking about a holistic approach. And that's in the end what does build trust with your customers. So you don't have to necessarily put them through the same rigor each time. Or if they do go through a certain rigor, you can leverage those attributes, that information that you've collected, for a variety of different outcomes and purposes in your own organization. So you're not interrupting that customer journey and making it feel overly burdensome or over friction, right?
Yep. And, communication, again, another theme I think that's going to keep cropping up, sharing with your user why you're doing something, what information you're collecting, and why you need to collect that information, I think can go a long way. It's, I guess, kind of a cliche in the sense like, if you want to receive, you just need to ask. And a big part of that ask is being polite with the consumer and respecting them enough to say, hey, look, we understand that you're a smart person and we need to collect this information for these reasons. Here's what we're going to do with it. Here's if we're going to keep it or not. And here's how you can assist us in meeting these goals. And here's the benefit to you. I think a lot of the consumer discomfort around how some data is collected is I don't know what you're doing with this and why you are requesting this information. Are you doing this to market to me? Are you doing this because you're going to sell it to someone else? But when you explain, look, this is to keep our platform safe. This is for us to provide you with the user experience that you want. And here are the tangential benefits that I can offer you if you do this. Hey, if you scan your driver's license, we can unlock your account limit up to $5,000 now. And people say, okay, that sounds reasonable to me, and I want to do that, and here you go.
And it comes down to full circle around consent, which we're not talking about today, but there's a big risk for your business as well, not necessarily against fraud, but around interactions with the user, around consent. And that's exactly it. That's that communication vehicle. We're getting consent from the user and explaining why their information is being used one way or another. And you're absolutely right. Our experience has been that if you just are clear and transparent, and it's not embedded in 30 pages of T's and C's, you get a much more willing customer and a much happier customer. So let's actually jump now into some solutions, right? So, and how identity verification in that process actually comes to play. Now we're going to do our second poll, our last poll of the day, because we want to understand what kinds of identity verification steps are individuals taking today, and how that works. So for everyone that just got the poll showing up, please let us know where you are today, how you are interacting with your customers today from an identities perspective. We'll keep it open for a few seconds here, and then we're actually we can flash the results. We'll share the results with everybody this time around. You won't have to just take my word for it. And then we'll get going into a bit more of a deep dive around the role that identity verification really plays today, and how it's churning out. And Cameron, I assume on your side, like the role, like identity verification is really sort of where we all begin in this conversation of fraud, risk, and compliance, right?
Yeah, I think there are a number of identity tools available, and if you think about, the customer identity lifecycle, you as an organization can begin building that customer identity in many cases even before they come into your organization. With the power of modern identity graphing and resolution and advertising technologies, a lot of times an organization might have a good idea of who somebody is before they even maybe come in as a customer, because they've targeted them with an ad. They've maybe responded to a customized offer or discount code that they have been proffered by virtue of the fact that you think they're a good fit for your organization. They come in, and then you can start layering on some deterministic identity elements on top of those probabilistic attributes you've already had. And I think this goes back to that kind of tapestry approach. Don't necessarily feel like you need to do it all in one bite. Again, you might scare them off. You might burden them with too much friction. If I go to buy something on Amazon and the first thing they do before I can even check out is say, give me a full copy of your passport, front and machine readable zone, I just say, that's, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to leave. So figuring out what elements you need at a point in time, again, to Zach's point, to meet your risk tolerance, maybe first say, hey, what's your mobile number? We want to verify that it's you. And then you can see, okay, the name they've provided and email address match what we got back from our mobile data provider. They confirmed with an OTP that it's them. And we did like a basic 2+2 check on their name and identity, or name and address rather. And they want to order something that's like, I don't know, $50. We're going to go ahead and we're going to let them transact, and we're going to see how it goes. And we're going to pay attention to how they're interacting with our platform. We're going to pay attention to the billing data, to the shipping address data, all of that, and begin building that perspective of the customer and following them in their customer journey. Now, maybe the next time they come in, all of a sudden it's like a new IP address. They load their card up with $10,000 worth of items, and the shipping address changes. Okay, now we might want to layer some friction. Now we might say, look, this is a big enough order that maybe asking this person for a scan of their identity document is not going to be a deal breaker for them. And we're going to let them know, hey, you've purchased a bunch of high value items. We want to make sure that your account hasn't been taken over, and let them know this is actually for your benefit as well. And take that, again, gradient risk-based approach to, okay, let's only ask them for the pieces of information that we need at that point in time. And we're going to communicate with them along the way to explain why we're doing what we're doing. And you can meet your risk tolerance that way, as well as providing a delightful experience for that customer.
Absolutely, agreed. And I think what the responses from the poll sort of clarify that is that we start with identity information, typically text-based, and we can move to documents. Then we continue to add more processes where it's needed. But I think I think the bottom line is that this adoption is growing, and it's very clear that organizations, big and small, different verticals, but marketplaces and financial services, historically being very large, continue to grow in terms of their adoption of these kinds of tools, and especially making them automated, because manual tends to cost a lot of money, prone to a lot of human error, and it's not the most efficient way to manage those low risk details. But I'm actually going to jump ahead to the next one, because I really think that before we jump into some sort of examples, trust and safety is a really growing area of fraud prevention, of identity verification. And for the folks listening in, we actually have two pieces. There's different use cases. So one can be a compliance use case, like Cameron and I talked about with your regulatory obligation. And when we're talking about fraud prevention, it often lends itself to more of a trust and safety use case. So we're not only trying to prevent against fraud, but we want to create and maintain a clean and healthy ecosystem of users, so that the individuals and customers that are in your marketplace, for example, are real people with real intentions, and they're not bots, fake actors, or fake profiles trying to defraud other real participants within the ecosystem itself. So this whole area behind how do we reduce fraud, it's so multi-pronged, because it then resolves to, I can create a trustworthy online environment for my users, and that community is safe to interact, which lends to your brand, which lends to your perception, which lends to your scale and success as a business, because you don't want to join a community, you do not want to transact in a marketplace if it's riddled with fraud. And so all of these different pieces really tie together. And Cam, what's your experience been on the marketplace side, right? Because we've just seen this use case and this need explode in recent times, hey?
Yeah, I mean, trust and safety as a field has really come into focus just even over the course of my 4 years with OWI. Even back in, call it 2015, 2016, a lot of times those teams on an org chart would still be considered either risk and compliance or a fraud and payments risk team. And we've seen, leading organizations like Airbnb kind of be pioneers in calling out trust and safety as a space that they want to focus on, and really treating that as independent from maybe some of the other types of financial fraud that you might be vulnerable to. And that is where identity verification, I think, has come into its own, because it's one thing to feel comfortable about taking payment from someone. It's another thing to get that level of assurance that makes you feel comfortable as a platform of like bringing two strangers together in physical space, which I think is what differentiates trust and safety from a pure risk and compliance mindset. And so, that's where, again, I think there is an opportunity to certainly layer together both device attributes, probabilistic attributes, and deterministic identity attributes, and communicate with that customer. Again, when you let people know that you are gathering a scan of their identity and matching against a selfie, for example, for their own security on a platform, I think that makes them that much more likely to be willing to provide that information. And trust and safety, that internal communication piece, really, really critical, because while it's not a perfect one-to-one match, the signals that you might use to identify an economic fraudster can also be great trust and safety signals, and vice versa. So while I do think they're unique disciplines and require a different set of risk tolerance, going back to that risk-based approach, when you have people in physical space, obviously I think the risk is much higher in some regards, because it's not just a dollar loss, like it's somebody's life, and maybe much more of a bigger threat to the core reputation of your platform if something were to happen to somebody in physical space. But keeping those lines of communication open, because fraudsters do work in many of the same ways across these disciplines, and pollinating those signals across your organization is critical to success as well.
So these are all amazing points, and I want to get into an example of what it can actually look like when you're building a tool. So we've talked about a holistic approach. We've talked about varying different risk levels. We've talked about how to get coordination internally, and we've talked about all the different types of fraud vectors and threats you can have. And so what do we do? And I'd like to concentrate really quickly on, how Trulioo and approaches this problem from an identity verification perspective. But really, we can think of ourselves as a network, and that network and that marketplace of identity tools is really that best approach, in our opinion, so we can layer in those different risk tolerances so that we can use the right service when you need it. And you can approach the varying different use cases so that you can achieve that internal harmony. And it's so hard, helping run a tech company and you running your own business. Even when we think about other tools around the organization that we leverage, they create silos. You have one person using it for this reason, another person using it for that reason. How do we centralize some of that control and visibility, but make it flexible enough for everyone to get what they need out of the system? And one of those approaches is really that holistic model. And so creating a single platform where you can leverage the different tools you need when you need them. And this is one really good example that we've seen with our customers is you'll have everything interacting with the user, but in the back end, you're able to throw a risk intelligence tool. You're able to throw a watch list check, a business verification if it's a legal entity, facial recognition or some biometrics. Leverage a variety of different types of tools and services to, at the end of the day, ensure you're identifying your users safely, ensure you're preventing against fraud, but also having that flexibility and future-proofing the solution so that when your environment does change, when those fraudsters, who, as we've said, are professionals in their own right, are adapting to the environment, that you can equally adapt by just dropping in these new friction points or new tools and services as you go without having to have to rip out a technology solution and replace. You're really just adding and maneuvering into a clean orchestration across your organization. And Cam, I've seen a lot of success with this model. We've continued to build and focus on this model. What are your viewpoints in terms of how do we achieve that holistic view and implement solutions that can be leveraged for everybody for a variety of different use cases out there?
I mean, I think the buzzword that you hit on, that is one that I've probably heard more on any of my conference calls than any other term in 2021, is orchestration. Everybody is looking for an orchestration layer because they're realizing no matter what the challenge they're facing, whether it's on the payment side, whether it's on the fraud and risk side, whether it's on the trust and safety side, it is about orchestrating all of these different signals. And I keep going back to this analogy, but turning individual pixels of data into that broader picture. And networks are a big part of that. We're seeing the market react to this networked approach in a positive way. We had Equifax purchasing Count. We've seen Sift kind of becoming a unicorn in its own right. A bunch of other kind of LexisNexis buying Emailage. So it's pretty clear that the market is moving towards this approach because the buyers do not want to spend the engineering lift and time and resources to develop their own internal, waterfall model, for example, to stack all these different vendors together and manage them. It really is easier to have it through a single API all in one place and be able to call on all of these different data sets and pull a meaningful, unified picture out of them from a single source.
What, Cam, and I think that sometimes we overlook that this stuff is hard. It's really challenging and it's really difficult. And when I put myself in the shoes of compliance and risk or just trust and safety officers at some of these organizations that are growing so quick, it's really hard to get a handle on all the changing vectors and all the different technologies and tools out there. And it really is beneficial to get a trusted partner that can help understand the landscape and help to A/B test and pull on other examples from other experiences that they can leverage and just plug and play implement for your organization. I mean, when you say it's a tough environment out there, and you need people that can help, right?
Yep, and being able again to you leverage these network effects to pick up on signals that maybe someone else has seen, I think is a trend that we're continuing to see in the marketplace as well. To your point, look, it's really challenging, and these are well-funded and really smart folks who are on the other side of the screen, committing this fraud. And so being able to leverage industry expertise when you can get it through a vendor, I think is really, really helpful, because the the cost of maintaining a whole set of experts who can build this out internally is quite high. And unfortunately, fraud risk is in some ways disproportionate to the revenue opportunities. It's almost like, short selling a stock in some ways. Like your gain could be pretty good, but your risk is almost unlimited, because if someone starts exploiting something on your platform, it can really get out of hand quickly. So making sure that you as an organization are prepared for those threats, I think is even more critical in 2021.
And we even see it with very large organizations that have been in this world, in a digital environment for many, many years, and have actually built out siloed independent solutions globally. This is a lifesaver for them, just because continuing to even manage that type of deployment is incredibly complex. It's incredibly expensive. And to be honest, it's ineffective, like you said, like the network effect. You're not even taking advantage of your own internal correlations and combinations and observations. And so it really is about a partnership to try and make sure that we are greater than the sum of our parts. And the more that there's a collaborative, cooperative effort, the better results we're going to get when you think about fraud prevention on a global scale. And so I think this is our last slide before we'll do a bit of Q&A. Just to take a few key points, right? So there are fraud impacts all over the place that aren't just financial. It's reputational risk as well. We talked a lot about the risk-based approach and how that can help. And we really, hone in on a holistic model and how we can leverage our different tools, services, and data, frankly, to ensure we can be the greater whole and leverage all of the different points throughout an organization, but also perhaps a shared ecosystem between similar like businesses if we're all on the same network and sharing and communicating on that information. And so just some real key takeaways of our presentation today. And I'd really like to thank everybody for joining. What we're going to do now is Cameron and I are available for any questions, and we can just hash through any specifics that people want to double click on, or if there's something that we didn't get to today but you're interested in, please, by all means, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Zac and Cameron. That was so interesting. We have had some questions, so I'm going to dive right in, and you can decide which of you would like to answer, or maybe both. So the first question we have, now I think this mentions a specific company you might be familiar with, but part of T&S's role is connecting the operations side of company with EPD. So glad you guys are talking about it. Do we see any fraud vectors that have laid dormant with COVID coming back into markets post? Does that make sense? If I read it in the wrong way.
I think it makes sense. Cam, do you want to take a first shot, or should I?
Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm wrapping my head around the question. So they're asking about fraud vectors that maybe are coming back now that the economy is moving away from a pure COVID mindset, if I'm understanding that correctly.
That's what I'm getting it as, yeah.
Yeah, I think, in some ways, I'm curious to see what enterprises do as we move forward and as face-to-face interactions become possible again. I do think in some ways digital transformation is a one-way street, and the organizations that have really changed to a digital first mindset their consumers, I think, are going to stick with that, even with the opportunity to do face-to-face interactions. Like once you've gotten used to doing all of your banking and account opening online, I don't know if you ever really want to like trudge back over to the bank branch. So in some ways, I think the fraud vectors that we have seen emerge in COVID targeting pure online processes are going to be here to stay. I do think there will be continued threats from, for example, synthetic identity and account takeover as we continue to embrace these digital first accounts, like seizing somebody's account when it is purely online, as well as spinning up new synthetic identities. I think is going to remain a persistent threat. We very well might see that when we go back to face, and if masks persist, folks trying to pass off, in-person fake IDs because you don't want to take your mask off in person. So I think that's something to keep an eye out for. But I think the ability of organizations to combat that can leverage digital identity elements. Like if somebody wants to come in when they schedule their appointment, you could push them an identity verification scan from the privacy of their own home that binds to that device. And then all they do is come into your branch and present that device. They don't have to take their mask off, and you've already done their proofing, and they can just complete the transaction face-to-face in whatever form they're comfortable. But leveraging the best parts of digital and physical interactions, getting the paperwork, getting the identity proofing out of the way remotely, so when you're in person, you can really transact with the part of the transaction that is best done in physical space. I think there's tremendous opportunity there for organizations to cut down on fraud risk as well as reduce friction.
And maybe I'll just add to that is that we've had a lot of recent success with more legacy financial institutions, I would say, as opposed to like neobanks or like digital first fintech. But what they've done is they've actually conceptualized the digital transformation and the digital journey with physical points layered in with throughout it. And that's actually a smart approach to remember with all of these types of activities. It never should be either or, because a customer is going to choose whatever they're comfortable with. So unless you're making a determination where I'm only going to go after this target market and we're going with it, we're a digital only organization, hey, that's one thing. But if you exist in a physical world and you want to layer these together, there's no reason you cannot. You just need to plan it in that way. So the example Cameron said, if you go to an organization and you're presenting physical documents, if you're presenting physical ID, there is nothing stopping you from weaving that through your actual digital journey, but you don't have to force the individual to go through both. It's how they play together. And what's amazing about the technology today is that if you're dealing with a sophisticated vendor who understands that world, they will be able to walk you through that and give you examples of how it's worked. We've done it with various different organizations as well. So it's a really great question. I think the fraud vectors will actually, there's always going to be new ones out there. And I think that if there's something that was dormant in a COVID world that will reoccur in a post-COVID world, you can bet it will happen. And so it's really just about thinking about all of these areas holistically, and not assuming that because something was solved or there was an external change that led to a different approach, that it's just going to go away. There's always organizations and people out there that are going to try old and new. It's just like an old computer patch or a software support thing. Everyone thought it was gone, and then all of a sudden it comes right back up. All right, so let's move on to maybe another question. It sounds like there's a bunch of them coming in, which is great. Thank you.
There are, Zac, and I don't think we're going to get time to answer all of them before the hour, but we will obviously get back to everyone that's answered a question by email, and we'll pass on the questions to you guys. So just quickly, someone has asked here what you can tell us about seller fraud. What are the concerns / unmet needs here?
And so I'm gonna assume seller fraud is like a marketplace fraud. Someone's signing up for an account to sell something online, and there's some seller risk onboarding processes there. And oftentimes what's really interesting that I've seen in the last little while with seller fraud is because the digital economy is so accessible now. It's often you don't have like when you think about a legal entity or a business who wants to sell something online, it's been established. There's a huge paper trail. You can get at the directors, the ownership structure, super easy. It's actually gone completely the opposite, where not only is it many individuals who are in that seller marketplace now, but they might have incorporated a very small business that isn't necessarily registered with the government organization, or if it is, it's very new. And so you have all of these. We used to think about consumers in a way around thin file consumers, which is people that don't have a huge credit history. It's a similar exact thing in seller marketplaces as well. So very tricky to deal with. There's legislative changes in Europe that are working towards making sure we have very strong registries of company and corporate information in the US. There's some drivers there as well. And it's really about taking a holistic and layered approach with them as well. So you can verify and validate that the company exists. And you do that by having a global service that can really tap into all the different corporate registrars. But what you'll ultimately be left with is an individual, or a UBO, as they say in Europe, or just an ownership structure. And you want to perform that same type of identity verification on them as well. And so you will have a little bit more of a dual lever there, but you want to approach it within the same system, just have the appropriate tools. Cam, what do you think on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think you laid out a lot of the risks, and I think in terms of mitigating them, the efforts that you can make to limit the scalability of this type of fraud are really critical. Again, going back to the fact that these fraud organizations are looking to achieve these things at a high velocity and repeat them. The way you can really cut the legs out from under these types of fraudsters is making it so that you cannot easily open up 100 accounts, and that you cannot pretend to be 100 unique people. So whether that's requiring a unique phone number, whether it's tying back to deterministic identity attributes, in some way making it so that the burden of proving to the platform that you are a unique person to make 100 different accounts to create that fraud is more than the value of the fraud they're going to commit, I think is critical. Because look, they are going to get found out. Like if you're defrauding somebody by not shipping them the item, you're going to get found out pretty quick, especially if you're, as a platform, limit the velocity of transactions a new seller can make. So the way they're going to succeed is by continually being able to churn in new accounts in a programmatic and systemic fashion, and cutting those legs out from under the fraudsters, I think, is a really solid approach for preventing the risk of that seller fraud from getting too high for your platform.
Awesome. There's so much in that, and whoever asked the question, I'd encourage you to reach out to both of us afterwards, because there's just a ton more layers. It's a really good question. But why don't we try and get one more in, yeah?
Let's squeeze in one more. If you can wrap this one up in a minute or two, that would be great, so that we're tightly finishing on the hour. And this is, what role does standards play in mitigating fraud risk?
We'll try and talk quick, but I guess standards, Cam, what do you think of like standards? Do you think that would be like legislative standards or industry standards around colleagues or different people in similar organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple things come to mind. On the regulatory side, you might think of things like CCPA or GDPR. I guess you might say, fortunately for the fraud landscape, pretty much every piece of fraud legislation that's either been passed or is currently on the table, fraud and risk enjoys pretty broad carve-outs in terms of how you can collect and leverage data if you are doing it explicitly for fraud and risk and cybersecurity applications. So I would say those standards apply less. I think one area to keep a watch out for is standards around digital identity, things like self-sovereign identity, things like digital driver's licenses, which might really come into play in terms of making sure that your platform can be interoperable with where consumers are adopting forms of digital identity, or standards for things like FIDO Online, biometric authentication, 2FA. So I think definitely an area to keep an eye on as an organization. We haven't seen any one standard in that regard really gain critical mass, but I think when something does start gaining critical mass, it might explode quickly, so definitely worth staying abreast of the latest developments to make sure you can handle how consumers want to attest their identity to you as an organization.
And just 10 seconds, because right after I passed it over to you, I was thinking, yeah, of course, the open banking standards and the different digital ID schemes that are happening in countries and definitely in Europe. I think that those are standards to try and get interoperability around digital ID schemes, but I don't think it's going to necessarily prevent against fraud. And there's going to be equal amounts of opportunity from fraudsters to try and penetrate those systems. And so the same rules should apply, not to forget your fraud prevention techniques just because there's an interoperable standard being set. But we'll leave it there because I think we're out of time, but I'll let you close it off.
That was perfect, perfectly on the hour. So thank you again, Zac and Cameron. And just to wrap up, don't forget that this is available online at marketplacerisk.com, and we also have the platform podcast. So do tune into that on the website or on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And we'll see you all again soon. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.